At 6:47 a.m. on November 3, 1944, Private First Class Michael Donovan crouched on the third floor of a ruined hotel in Metz, France, peering through the narrow tunnel of his scope while a cold wind pushed dust across the broken windows. The Americans were taking casualties not from frontal firefights, but from shots that came from the edges, snipers working in pairs, one drawing attention, the other slipping the angle and killing men who thought they were safe. Something about that morning felt like a turning point. Sight locked, breath held, and behind Donovan, the soft, steady weight of a partner who trusted him with his life. If this pulls you in, hit like and subscribe. Stay until the end. The story you're about to hear changed how American snipers fought in that sector. Donovan's unit had been in the Metz pocket for weeks. The ruins of the town smelled of cold stone and cordite, of baking bread long since burned in ovens, and of men's sweat. The 3rd Platoon snipers were a handful of young marksmen who had learned their trade in training ranges back in the States and then sharpened it under fire. They were meant to keep the company safe from the long, quiet kills that wore down morale faster than any artillery barrage. But in October and the early days of November of 1944, something else was happening. The enemy had begun to use a simple, lethal tactic. One German sniper would present himself, draw fire or attention, and a second shooter, positioned well off the line of sight, would take advantage of the instant distraction. Men were being killed from angles that a standard scoped sight simply did not allow one to see. The battalion's logs later listed 23 snipers lost in the campaign up to that point. Archival notes, where available, counted men lost to ambush and flanking shots. Those numbers were cold on paper, but Donovan could name faces. He could still taste the cigarette smoke from nights spent hunched beside Bradley and Chen. The losses pressed against him the same way the wind pressed against the shattered glass. James Bradley was from a farm in Pennsylvania. He had a laugh that folded up like a plow and hands that knew the feel of soil. Donovan remembered him once joking about being better with a pitchfork than a scope, then turning that quiet confidence into an unhurried shot the day he took out a machine gun nest at dusk. Bradley died on October 18. The platoon was repairing a barricade when the shot came. The log would later say a single round to the head, instant, and Bradley slumped as if someone had cut the rope that held him up. The men moved with a stunned, clumsy precision afterward, as if grief were another piece of equipment they had to lug. Robert Chen was smaller, city-bred, a quick talker who had sent his mother a postcard that never made it home. He went out to a rooftop to watch for movement on a gray morning at the end of October and did not come back. His death on October 29 was the kind that changes how a man breathes in bed. Sudden, terrible, proof that no skill could make a man invisible. Donovan felt these deaths like frost working through cotton, seeping into bones. He was a marksman. He had seen men fall before. But as these particular wounds stacked up, there was a new, rational anger that reached not toward the enemy, but toward the limits of the tools in his hands. A scope is a tunnel. Donovan thought of it like that now, when he lay flat, peering through the circular compass of glass. Through it, he could watch a roofline, count the breaths of a century, read the slant of a man's shoulders as if he were reading a page. But while his eye tracked the intended target, the building across the square, the bell tower, there was an entire world to either side that the scope simply erased. Peripheral vision did not exist inside a scope. The world narrowed to the width of an eyelash. In training, they had mocked it with a joke. Looking through a scope was like peering through a toilet paper tube. It was funny until it was not. The nights after Chen's death, Donovan did not sleep so much as invent a way of staying awake and working with the dark. He paced the 3rd floor, where the heat from a stove had long since died, his boots leaving tracks in the dust. He thought about mirrors sometimes, cheap pocket ones that men used to shave by in shallow puddles. Mirrors reflected, obviously. They broadened what you could see if you put them at the right angle. The idea came in small pieces at first, a thought about reflection, then a thought about angles, then a more urgent thought about how to stop men from being killed by the unseen. Donovan was not an engineer. He could take apart a watch and put it back together at home, but he had not been taught to invent in any formal way. What he had instead was the apprenticeship of war, the close observation of faults, the trial and error of life-and-death improvisation. He read the problem. He tried a few crude sketches in the margins of a ration book by the light of a small lamp. A mirror, mounted just to the side of the scope, angled so that when the sniper panned slowly, the mirror would catch the reflection of a likely flank and show it in the field of view. On a damp November night, when the wind sounded like something moving through broken pipes, Donovan sat at a makeshift bench in the doorway and took a small round shaving mirror from his pocket, something Martinez had slipped him as a joke earlier that week. He taped it first with a strip of medical tape, then with a cigarette wrapper for stiffness. His hands were steady, but his chest was a drum of nervous energy. The mirror sat off to a right and slightly forward of the objective lens of his scope, not blocking his sight line, but close enough that an eye looking through the eyepiece could catch what the mirror showed. "Looks like a woman's vanity," Martinez said when Donovan leaned the contraption against the sill. Martinez had the boyish face of men who had come into a war too soon. "It'll tell me if someone's sneaking from the side," Donovan answered without looking up. He adjusted the angle with small twists of wire scavenged from a torn field pack. The mirror flashed the lamp's light back into the room like a promise. They tested in the morning before dawn. Martinez sat 10 meters away, moving slowly across the rubble at the edge of the ruined bakery, pausing and then crouching as if checking a line. Donovan looked through the scope and saw, out of the corner of that small reflected patch, Martinez's movement as if through a second eye. It was crude, the image was small and jittery. But where the scope's direct view offered tunnel vision, the mirror supplied a sudden peripheral clue. "What you get?" Martinez asked. His breath steamed in the air. "Something," Donovan said. "Slow, but it's something." The first field test that mattered happened days later. November 3rd was a cold, sharp day. The ruined bakery across the square had become a point of contention. It offered a stable chevron of stone that could conceal a shooter and provided a snug little angle for a man waiting to pick a moment. The American advance needed the bakery silenced to push forward. Donovan and Martinez took positions on the hotel's 3rd floor. Their rifles were M1903 Springfields with scopes, the standard issue in that role in their formation. The mirror had been fastened more securely for this outing. Strips of adhesive, a backing plate of salvaged metal, a length of soldered wire forming a simple hinge. It looked ridiculous to anyone who did not understand its purpose. To the men who saw it, it was a lifeline. They had orders to observe rather than to charge. The company would move when the artillery made the call. Time congealed into small units of breath. Donovan's scope fixed on a multed shadow against the bakery's doorway. He watched. Through the mirror at the edge of his sight, something moved along the far wall. Too quick, a shape hardly more than a suggestion. He froze, letting the scope and the reflected view tell different parts of the same truth. "Left," Martinez whispered. He did not say it as a command, it was a piece of news. Donovan eased the scope to the left in small degrees, keeping the primary crosshairs on the doorway. The mirror picked up a boot, then a knee, then the barrel of a rifle, angled. The second shooter was there, positioned to take advantage of a distraction the first might create. They worked as if in a single head. Donovan moved the crosshairs to the reflected trace of the second man, lined up the distance, the wind, the faint cloud of dust that said how the man's weight sat, and squeezed. The report snapped like a rope. A man went down in the bakery doorway. The first sniper, the one trained to draw attention, shifted his gaze perhaps out of reflex, or perhaps forced by a shout across the square intended to bait. Martinez, watching the reflection now, saw the other man's shoulder move, and took a second careful shot. The two shots were not cinematic in the way training manuals imagine. They were a small, plain coordination that looked like competence and nothing more. Afterward, the square was quiet, except for the distant sound of trucks and the low hum of men breathing hard. "What did you see?" Martinez asked, voice thin. "Boot, moving like he was second," Donovan said. He felt the simplicity of the sentence like a thing boiled down to its bones. In the sudden lull that followed, men on the street hesitated, then pressed forward under covering fire. The company moved. No one in Donovan's sight line had been taken from behind. Bradley's and Chen's faces did not appear in the square that day, but the particular terror they had brought home, the sudden unseen angle, was for a moment held at bay. Word traveled the way it always does in companies, through quick visits to raked-out bunks, by the whispered curiosity of men who had not been up on the third floor, and finally to Sergeant Frank Wilson, who had been a hunter in Ohio and understood the kindness of an extra eye. Wilson showed it to other snipers. He understood how it could widen what a scope narrowed. By November 5, a couple of other men had mounted crude reflections on their own rifles. There was a moral problem, though, as there often is in wartime: regulations. A rifle was issued with a catalog of acceptable attachments and modifications, and what Donovan had created was not among them. It was, in the language officers used, an unauthorized field modification. That mattered in a place where supply and accountability were the bones of survival. It mattered because it could be cited in any after-action report as undisciplined tinkering. But it mattered more that men were not dying. Captain Robert Hayes was both a man of the regulation and a man of the field. He had spent years in the Army watching the world alter itself between training and reality. When he came up to the rooftop on November 10 for an inspection, he looked at the mirror with eyes that registered both skepticism and the faint calculation of a man who had to keep a company alive. He did not immediately make a decision that would forever alter the battalion's procedures. He inspected, questioned, and watched men demonstrate. Then he did something that some would later call pragmatic and others would call courageous. He ordered the battalion to adopt the modification as a standard practice despite the lack of formal approval. It was Hayes's choice to prefer immediate lives over paperwork. But that day's inspection and Hayes' order belonged to the next part of the record. On November 3rd, the important fact was simpler. The mirror had worked in the bakery, and for that one small operation, the unit had moved forward without paying the hidden price they had been exacted before. The men who had looked through Donovan's improvised second eye that day felt something like relief. It was a practical relief, not a lyric one. No raptures, no medals. Martinez clapped Donovan on the shoulder, hard enough to make him limp with the aftershock. "You saved 2 of us today," Martinez said later, while they packed the rifles and checked sights. His voice had a way of being both earnest and rough, like gravel warmed by sun. Donovan could not count the ways he wanted to deny it. He had not been thinking of himself as a savior. He had been thinking of angles and light and the small arithmetic of death. Yet there was a hollow place inside him that responded to Martinez's gratitude in the only way he knew how, with a shrug and a voice that did not carry. "Just fix the problem," he said. It was not false modesty so much as an economy of language developed by men who learned to keep their heads clear. The bakery engagement did not make the war. It did not stop the shelling or the long attrition of men. But it did change a tactical moment in a way that could be repeated. Over the next days, the mirror became less of a secret and more of a whispered recommendation. Sergeants approved it in the absence of officers. Officers learned of it when it affected the bottom line of men returning to their squads. The modification spread not because anyone took out a form and filed a request, but because in the immediate logic of combat, a method that saved men's lives was worth adopting. Donovan found himself at an awkward remove from what he had made. He tightened screws and taped a backing plate for one of the replacement mirrors in a dim patch of the ruins, and felt the oddness of crafting a tool that men would rely upon but that no bureaucracy would recognize as theirs. He never sought recognition. The hum of guilt that had propelled him, his sense that a better apparatus might have kept Bradley and Chen alive, was quieted by the small fact that Martinez and others were still breathing. That quiet was not healing, but it was actionable. It moved him to do the next sensible thing, without thinking of medals or credit. In the mornings, he could sometimes catch his own reflection in the mirror mounted to his rifle. The image was small and fractured, a man in a wool cap with dust on his collar. The mirror that had been a tool became, for moments, an object of private symbol. It reflected back a narrow image of himself, but it also offered a sliver of the broader world, an uncanny way of seeing both self and surroundings. The object of polished glass acquired resonance beyond utility. It was only a pocket mirror taped to a rifle, but symbols do not need gilding to work. Archive notes later described that the modification reduced certain kinds of flank shot losses in the sector, and Aberdeen's evaluation in January 1945 would catalog the technique's effectiveness for institutional eyes. Historians would eventually estimate that the adoption of the reflective mount, combined with adjusted patrol patterns, saved dozens of lives across the front in those months. Estimates that ranged widely and were careful to be labeled as such. Historian estimate or archival analysis in the footnotes. Donovan learned none of this at the time. He learned small things, how Martinez would whistle when nervous, how the mirror would fog up in heavy breath, and how a steady thumb could clear it without losing sight. The moral of those days was cramped into a series of brief decisions. Make the mirror, test the mirror, use the mirror when it matters. There were nights when Donovan lay awake and thought of Bradley's laugh and Chen's quick speech, and felt the familiar pull of regret. He was careful to translate regret into action rather than letting it calcify into bitterness. He taught others how to mount a mirror. He taught Martinez to set the angle so that it would catch the edge of a field while the crosshair held the center. He taught them how to clear condensation without giving up a shot. On a clear afternoon a week after November 3, Donovan stood near a battered radio set that hissed with the low sound of static and distant command chatter. A supply sergeant walked up with a parcel and 2 sealed envelopes from headquarters. "Inspection next week," the sergeant said. His voice was flat but not unkind. Donovan folded his hands around the small parcel and looked at the mirror's face. He felt, briefly, like a man about to hand over a secret that was as much a confession as an invention. Secrets in war are salted with the knowledge of lives saved and lives lost. They sit oddly on a man's tongue. He thought of the mirror again as a thing that could be placed in a museum decades later and labeled politely as a field modification. He thought of it perhaps being photographed under bright lights and catalogued with a caption that omitted names in favor of procedures. That possibility felt far off and strangely irrelevant. For now, there were patrols to coordinate, shells to dodge, and men whose lives were bound to what he and a few others had sewn together with tape and wire. The mirror had altered the rhythm of how they watched the world. It had changed the way a scope was used, not only to see, but to be aware of what lay beyond sight. It was the kind of small change that, in the machinery of war, could make a terrible difference. Donovan worked without grand design. He found a modest set of bolt heads in a toolbox and fashioned a small clamp for a mirror that would fit on more rifles. On an overcast morning, he walked down the line and offered a piece to Sergeant Wilson. "Put that up on Jennings' rifle," he said. "He watches the bakery on second watch." Wilson took the clamp, examined it, and then nodded. There was no ceremony. The clamp clinked against boot metal. It was only later that Donovan would become aware of the human calculus that underpinned all these exchanges. Soldiers did the small things that made survival a bit likelier and then moved on. Recognition was an afterthought. There simply was not time enough in a war for many afterthoughts. That evening, after the men had eaten a mechanically warmed stew and checked their rifles, Donovan sat by the window and watched the sky over Metz go the color of iron. He thought of Bradley and Chen, and of the way their absence altered the rhythm of jokes and cigarette breaks and the casual cruelty of fatigue. He thought of Hayes, who would visit for inspection, who held the authority to turn tacit practice into formal order. He felt a mixture of dread and relief. The latter was practical. The former, a worry that someone else might take the method and that someone else would take the credit or compartmentalize the story into a dry evaluation. In the ruined bakery down the road, men cleared rubble and prepared to move in at first light the next day. Donovan fitted another mirror and checked its angle, the metal cold under his fingers. When he looked into the small glass, his face was a shallow ghost. He wiped the condensation away with a thumb and thought of the odd justice of small things. What a little mirror could reveal. How a narrow reflection could save a life. What a man would give to keep another from never returning home. The first mission had been a small miracle of coordination, not because of a divine hand, but because of a human one that refused to accept an unchanging limit. There was humility in that. To invent, to share, to avoid proclamation. The mirror was not a triumph in a parade, but a quiet salvage of lives that, if uncounted, would still have mattered one by one. Word reached Captain Hayes within a week. Hayes came up the stairs himself on November 10th, took the mirror between his fingers and squinted. He asked direct questions. How much did it obstruct? Was it stable?
Under recoil, did it fog easily? And he watched demonstrations. He did not rush any decision that day. He was a man who had to weigh charts and lives in the same breath. Later, when he signed the order that made the practice standard for the battalion, men would remember him as the officer who put life over regulation. But November 3 remained the night when Donovan and Martinez had first seen how a small reflection could shape the shape of danger. Donovan could not foresee the institutional steps that would follow: the inspection, the battalion order within days, the Aberdeen evaluation in January 1945 cataloging the effectiveness of the technique, and the slow drift of recognition and omission that would follow the war. He could not foresee the historian who, decades later in 1987, would dig through dusty reports and find references to an anonymous field modification, and then trace it back through interviews to a man who had never sought credit. He could not foresee that an article in 1989 would finally tell the story to a wider public, or that his name would remain absent from some formal evaluations, even as survivors later sought him out with gratitude. On the third-floor sill, after the bakery engagement and before Hayes's inspection, Donovan sat with his rifle across his knees, and the mirror catching in its tiny gleam the ragged light of a France he barely recognized. The object in his hands was ordinary, a pocket mirror taped to a makeshift mount. But it held, in its smallness, a kind of moral geography. The edges of sight, the urgency of improvisation, the refusal to allow the narrowness of a tool to determine a man's death. He thought of what he would do when the war stopped speaking in orders and began to speak in ordinary life. Whether he would tell his story, whether anyone would listen, whether the mirror would ever be more than a functional piece of glass. For now, there were men to guard and a narrow human triumph to sustain. Donovan tightened a screw, breathed once, and listened for the sound of boots beyond the street. The reflection in the mirror was steady, so was his hand. In a war that often celebrated grand gestures, a man had chosen, quietly and without permission, to widen the gaze. That choice rippled outward in ways he could not yet measure. He did not expect applause. He expected the work to continue. The days ahead would bring answers and bureaucracy, evaluations and numbers, the slow and sometimes cold translation of practice into doctrine. They would also bring small intimacies, Martinez's offhand thanks, the press of a comrade's palm on a shoulder, the soft, private way a man says his name at a graveside. Donovan held both the mechanical and the moral in his hands, and, for the first time since Bradley and Chen had been taken, felt that grief had produced something that might stand between others and the same fate. When dusk fell that day over Metz, Donovan walked down the stairwell with the rifle slung and the mirror quietly secure.
The town around them was patient and composed in its destruction. Walls that once held pictures, door frames that held no doors, the bakery with its gaping teeth of broken ovens. He paused at the threshold of the street and glanced at the mirror one last time, catching his own face in its tiny glass. It looked back at him without judgment. A week later, the battalion would be ordered to adopt the modification. Men would fashion clamps and backups and pass along instructions that read like a prayer. Set the mirror to catch the field beyond your scope, keep it tight, clear the condensation, keep your head down. Historians would label those instructions with dates and evaluations. Veterans would later come to his funeral and stand in a small clustered line to whisper thanks. But at that moment, in the rubble and the cold iron of November, the small reflective glass did what it was meant to do. It let him see the edge of what his eyes already knew, and, in doing so, kept a handful of men alive to see another dawn. The mirror turned what had been a single fatal angle into a story of survival, one reflection at a time. A week later, the battalion order arrived in neat official language. Field modification authorized, reflective sighting device to be employed in urban observation positions where direct line of sight is obstructed. It read like every other directive that passed from headquarters to men in the field, stamped with numbers and a time to be obeyed. The language could not contain, for all its formality, the small geometry of fear that had been changed in a single window. In practice, the order meant men in 3 rifle companies bent over workbenches in cold billets, hammering clamps from scavenged metal, drilling notches into bayonet mounts, fashioning joints from the springs of broken watches and the backs of pocket lighters. Martinez taught a dozen others how to tape a mirror so that it would not rattle, how to clear its condensation with a bandana and breath at the right moment, how to angle the glass so that the reflected field lay exactly at the edge of human reaction. The instructions the battalion issued later would be brief and clinical. The workmen at the benches learned, muttered, tested, cursed, and eventually grinned, in the way men do when something mechanical becomes suddenly intimate. There were hurried field trials in the following nights. In a narrow street near a ruined church, a patrol that had been pinned by a sniper's 3-second window saw the flash of a rifle catch in a mirror and adjusted a sweep that broke the line of fire. In another village, a sergeant who had always favored quick charges stopped, leaned to a small glass, and found the peripheral motion of a child sending someone to fetch aid rather than to shoot. Each success folded into the next with no ceremony. The men began to leave small mirrors attached to their packs, and when a new recruit came up short on equipment, a veteran would slip a spare into his palm and say simply, "There, keep your head down." Hayes, when he came with inspection sheets and a palette of regulation and suspicion, watched a demonstration with the distracted politeness of a man who had spent his life aligning reality with protocol. He signed off on the practice with a marginal note: "Field expedient accepted. Report results." The note carried the quiet authority of bureaucracy. It did not record the look on Martinez's face when he saw Donovan steady the mirror under roofline and then nod, not to the form, but to the men who would live because of it. Hayes would later accept reports that spoke of reduced casualty rates and clearer perimeters. He would not write the names of those who had first put their hands to the glass. The months after November folded into the cold mathematics of war. The mirror joined the list of small inventions that changed the shape of engagements without ever becoming headline news. In January, Aberdeen catalogued the modification as Field Innovation 445, Enhanced Peripheral Observation. The report included charts and interviews, reductions and equations to prove efficacy. The word Donovan did not appear. It did not need to. The change had already been translated into a set of procedural boxes, clamps, maintenance, training schedules. That translation saved lives in the same quiet, unglamorous currency as a bandage. Donovan survived the next campaigns the way men survive, with instruments that guard them, by paying attention and by refusing to be measured only by the questions others chose to ask.
He returned to a country that had endured its own fractures and bear-like resentments. He did not return to ceremony. He sought instead the small syncretic comforts of ordinary life. A rented room with a window that let in a street of sparrows. A job at a bakery where flour dusted his hair, and the rhythm of kneading gave him a kind of order he had not known in war. The mirror came home with him in the small tin, wrapped in a handkerchief stained with smoke and mileage. Over the years, veterans found him in those small ways. Memory finds the men who made it through. Martinez came in 1953 with a quiet grin and a story of a son now grown who did not remember the shape of a window in France, but who knew the sound of an uncle's laugh. Others arrived with folded letters, clumsy thanks offered like coins. Donovan received thanks as if they were small, portable absolutions, not the kind that erased what had been taken, but ones that acknowledged the care of a life kept in debt to another life's prudence. He did not speak much of himself. When asked at
reunions why he had nailed a strip of metal to a mirror rather than wait for command to make a formal suggestion, he would say, "There was no time." That answer contained both the bluntness of necessity and, if the listener listened, the remade grammar of duty. He never sought the limelight. He preferred the quiet cleanliness of making the bread of a morning and repairing dented tins in the afternoons. The mirror sat on a shelf above his workbench, sometimes dull with dust, sometimes catching an angle of light that made the room seem a little larger. In 1987, a historian in a cluttered office with a pile of yellowed after-action reports and interview tapes traced small lines from the Aberdeen file back to oral histories and then to a list of men who had been present in Metz in November. The historian read an old interview in which Martinez, soft in his recollection, mentioned a man who just fixed a bit of glass and we all felt safer. The search that followed was patient and awkward. Veterans' names led to towns. Towns led to former wives and sons who had kept letters. The historian found Donovan not in a place of record, but in a small bakery that had by then another owner. When Donovan finally sat in a government office and signed a statement for the record, he did so with the impatience of a man who knew that paper would not change the nights he could not forget. An article in 1989 told the story to a wider public. The image of a pocket mirror taped to makeshift mounts, the photograph of a line of men squinting along a ruined street, the interviews with veterans who spoke about angles and breadth and the way a small object could reconstitute a decision made in cold light. The article were careful and a little sentimental. Some records it cited left his name out, others placed it in footnotes. Men who had died without a chance to tell their part remained ghosts in the margins. Donovan read the piece in a newspaper left on a bus seat and folded it in two and then smoothed it back out, as if trying to make the event itself a little less thin. At his funeral, years later, the line of veterans was not long, but it was steady. They came with small things, a rusted clamp, a pocket mirror polished to a sheen, a field jacket turned silent by time. They stood near the grave and, in the way of men who had seen too much, did not make large statements. Martinez placed his hand on the coffin and whispered thanks, not theatrical, but precise. "You kept us looking the right way." Others drew closer and spoke one name after another, as if naming them might trace back the shape of nights when they had seen someone else through the glass. They laid the little mirror on the folded jacket, atop the casket. For an instant, when the clouds broke, it caught the sun and flashed once like a small salute. The flash did not make news. It did not alter the ledger of history. It did fold, for those present, into the grammar of remembrance, the notion that what is small in the hand can be vast in effect, that the angle of sight is sometimes a matter of moral work as much as mechanical cleverness. Years after the headlines had passed and the reports settled in archives, Donovan's mirror remained a fragment of human geometry. It lived on in photographs, in a boxed file at Aberdeen,
in the hands of men who had learned to look twice before they leaned into danger. It also lived where things truly endure, in the unrecorded ways people pass care to one another, in the spare language of a grateful nod, in the simple practice of fixing what is at hand when the world has not yet offered a plan. An ordinary piece of glass had refused to be only a tool. It had become, for a span of men, a covenant, that sight could be widened, that a small improvisation could stand between a life and its end. The reflection it made was not heroic in the headline sense. It was stubbornly human. In the end, that stubbornness mapped a kind of fidelity to comrades, to craft, to the unfinished business of living. The mirror kept giving back the light it caught, and in that repeated, unassuming return, it taught what a man can do simply by choosing to look beyond the narrowest angle of danger.